Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege for me to be a keynote speaker this morning to this important conference. I'm going to give a presentation which will give a broad picture of rural transport, where we have come from, where we are, and possibilities for the future. The first 3 slides, I would like to introduce the organization that I work with, which is the Sub-Saharan African Transport Policy Program. The SSATP is an international organization and is a partnership of 36 African, Sub-Saharan African countries, together with the regional economic communities and donors. And the SSATP is a unique network of professionals for knowledge sharing. It is also in transformation. SSATP is in dynamic. We've been asked by our member countries and stakeholders to increase coverage, to cover the whole of Africa, to link more with the AU, because as Sub-Saharan African coverage, we are not linking really to the AU. And also, we have been asked to give more ownership to the member countries in Africa, as well as more anchoring in Africa to be able to increase visibility and to serve our clients better. And we have been asked also to increase partnership and strategic alignments. SSATP is focused on 3 themes. Theme 1 is transport sector strategies, which emphasize on linking the transport sector policies and strategies to the Millennium Development Goal, addressing poverty reduction. And theme 2 covers road management and financing, pursuing the road sector reforms. And we who know SSATP, we know the flagship program of road management and road management initiative, which spearheaded the formation of the road agencies and the road funds. And also we have rural transport, that's access and mobility, and we have urban mobility component under this theme 2, which is focused more on services. And theme 3 is regional integration for trade facilitation and focusing on improving performance of corridors. And this is the theme that has been very active in the recent past. And we also have cross-cutting issues, gender and inclusion, climate change governance, HIV/AIDS on corridors, data management, and knowledge and publication. The rural transport component of the SSATP, which relates to the conference that we are in now, was launched in 1990s to support policy development in rural transport. And it did so to the willing countries. And the policies were translated to strategies in form of programs. And we can recall programs such as the Rural Access and Mobility Pilot Activity in Malawi, and which also enabled the formation of the strategies for rural transport. And also we have the RAMP, Rural Access and Mobility Program in Zambia and Nigeria. We also had the VTTP, Village Travel and Transport Program in Tanzania, the Ethiopian Rural Travel and Transport Program, which you will hear about the advancement to a universal rural access program. And we also have knowledge and publications in this area, such as rural transport knowledge base, rural transport training materials, which we are in the process of updating, gender and rural transport initiative, etc. We are also doing a synthesis of knowledge products that are known. I mean, it's not only owned by SSATP, but also with other organizations, to be able to know where are the gaps and the way to fill the gaps. We also have a policy framework in place to link rural transport to other key sectors contributing to rural growth and poverty reduction. So that is the introduction of SSATP and what we do in a nutshell. And now we go to the slides which are really giving the broad picture of rural transport, access and mobility in Africa. And the rural transport infrastructure, for those who are new to the subject, who may think that rural transport is only roads, it's actually not only roads. It covers roads, bridges, tracks, trails, footpaths, drainage, waterways, and cableways in some mountainous areas like in Lesotho. And rural access, the definition is really connection in time and distance. In some rural areas, people cannot tell that this is 2 kilometers, but they know that they walked for 2 hours or they walked for the whole day. So, they tell it in that way. And rural mobility is that ability to transport people and goods. Rural accessibility is the measure of ease or difficulty in accessing locations and areas of services. And rural transport then can be improved by improving physical access like rural roads, footpaths, and trails, and so. But also can be improved by bringing facilities closer to people, that is improving proximity. It also can be improved by increasing mobility of people, transport means and services. And rural transport starts from the village and must serve the household needs. And the rural transport network within the rural area. There's also rural transport connecting to rural areas. So it has to offer that connectivity, but has to start from the household to serve also a small-scale farming and activities at household level. And now we go to rural access and mobility, past and present, as we go on. Rural transport policies and strategies. There are shortfalls. There are countries which have developed rural transport policies. There are those countries which don't have the policies. There are also those countries which have policies, but they cannot implement the policies. They can't translate them into actions. And when I talked about policy to one senior government staff, he actually told me that before you say anything about policy, we even need to understand the concept of rural transport, what it is, before we think about policy. There are issues of institutional arrangement and ownership of local infrastructure, because the unclassified infrastructure, unclassified roads, community access, sometimes it is thought that it is under the district. In some cases, it is thought that it is under the community. So the ownership has not really been clarified, and the institutional arrangements are also complex. And there's financing competition for scarce resources, which tend to marginalize rural transport. And in mid-1990s, rural roads in sub-Saharan Africa estimated at 50 billion in asset value. But do we know the current asset value now? Most of the countries have a network which is really estimated because it's not classified and because it doesn't have a specific ownership. So it's also difficult to know what exactly network we have and what's the value. There's also the issue of increasing unit cost for rural roads, 40,000 to 50,000, which is an issue in Africa now. And there's an issue of infrastructure maintenance. And also we have the issue of rural transport means and services and enabling regulatory frameworks and affordability. These are the issues that we are trying to deal with. And the scaling up and going beyond pilots for rural transport projects has really been a problem. It's not very common. I would like to commend Ethiopia for going forward. We also have the issue of governance and inclusion, which means that user participation in planning and setting priorities is quite important to increase transparency and also to increase effectiveness. Gender equality is not only the issue of equal men and women, it's actually an economic issue to improve productivity and development outcomes, because both men and women are stakeholders in transport. And in rural transport, women bear a bigger burden of the rural transport. There are issues of safety and security in rural transport. There's an issue of climate change and environmental effects, which is a topic in this conference. There's also an issue of rapid urbanization, going beyond 4.5 growth annually, And we have to assess the effects of urbanization to rural development, because more and more focus is going into urban areas and in investment also in developing urban centers. And we may think that this is a small issue. It's not, because rural urbanization may be caused by rural migration and lack of opportunities in rural areas for employment and income generation. And much of this also can be caused by poor rural transport and access. Are the problems too many to think about? I'm just asking myself, but I would rather say no, because I mean, this is why we are here, because solutions are being thought of, and they are, day by day we discover new solutions. And the policy issues, rural transport policies and strategies have to interface with other sectors. This is essential for poverty reduction and growth. It's not only interface, it's even social inclusion in the development of these policies and strategies to make a clear, good understanding of what this sector is. And we see now that there is a renewed focus in agriculture development in Africa, and also the rural transport context is evolving within this agricultural investment. And we require policy coordination. We also require sound criteria and tools to prioritize investment to make sure that complementary sectors are really served in a rational way in order to have core benefits. And if we are not careful, then we will find that we are not even benefiting from developing policies on developing rural transport. And the role of fiscal policy is central in allocating public resources in activities that yield high development return. We have to think of viable financing option for rural transport infrastructure, and also supportive fiscal policies to help communities to contribute. We can't just say that communities should contribute from nothing. There must be policies that would enable them to contribute. And the road sector reforms, we have had road sector reforms in each of our countries almost, but we don't know the degree of political consensus in the road sector reforms. And we are not sure if the road sector reforms have really affected the rural transport. For example, how much of the road fund money is going into the rural access infrastructure? We have to ask ourselves those questions. On institutional issues, rural transport infrastructure institutional issues are more complex than the institutions for infrastructure at higher level. We have decentralization reforms going on in many countries, and which gives institutional focus for planning and implementation to local communities, which in fact, it is good and more realistic to rural transport development. But we have a problem that of capacity to plan, for example, and we have a problem of financial limitations, restricting the opportunity for rural transport. And there's perceived lack of central organization and accountability. Even the technical support coming from the central ministries to support rural transport infrastructure development, for example, it is ad hoc in many countries. And also there are diverse planning tools for local level planning. And we need a planning continuum to help people to get a framework of evaluating and using procedures with the nature of activity that they are thinking of. So for decentralization, we need a long-term commitment from central government and donors to pursue the decentralization reforms. On the monitoring and evaluation, there's paucity of data, and also we have the problem of consensus on the role and purpose of different indicators, and we need theoretical framework to support decision-making on indicators. For example, the number of kilometers of road improves is not enough to measure performance in terms of efficiency and impact. And the rural access indicator is also said not to be sensitive on the improvement of existing road. It is actually just a road, 2 kilometers away from a road. Any road? No, it shouldn't be any road. It should be a good road and a quality road. And with the emphasis that is ongoing on outcomes and results, This should encourage planning and monitoring of outcomes in rural transport in terms of changes in travel time, passenger fares, freight traffic, commodity prices, etc. And the ongoing rural transport indicator study by AFCAP and IFRTD will shed more light into the monitoring and evaluation issues. The issue of rural transport infrastructure maintenance. Rehabilitation backlog, which is a legacy of underfunding maintenance, was for rural roads, for main roads 25% in 2008, and for rural roads 45%. Actually, we are talking of rural roads which are classified. We are not talking of unclassified roads. So there's much more on unclassified roads. Funding is critical for rural transport infrastructure, and we need analysis of gap per category of roads. But how do we know if we don't know exactly what network we have? And we are now seeing experimentation of performance-based contracts, and we have to ask ourselves, is this promising maintenance sustainability at a reasonable cost? Is it encouraging private sector innovation? Are there other ways of maintenance which are more promising? Okay. There's emphasis, we should emphasize maintenance at the design stage within the asset management approach. Also, we have to design for specific needs, increase spot improvement, focus on least cost solutions and innovations. And this is why we are here in this conference. And rural transport means and services. A good road is not necessarily sufficient to assure rural transport and rural growth. We see two women sitting on the side of a road, which seems to be a good road, and a good number of children. They are sitting on the dust, and there's health issue. They are waiting, and there's economic issue. They are standing there with crates of tomatoes. They are waiting for a vehicle which they don't know when it is going to come, but there's a good road there, which is passable. And what we see is lack of supportive institutional framework for rural transport means and services. Nobody's thinking much about it. And we are asking ourselves, are there proven business models for rural transport to underserved rural communities in developing countries? Some countries like Sri Lanka are trying, but we don't know where in Africa we are trying enough to address the problem of rural transport services. And we also need a good understanding of key barriers and incentives to encourage private sector innovation for provision of rural transport services. And under there we have a woman head loading, health and social costs, socio-economic costs of head loading. This is not a good thing, and sometimes it can also be called a human rights issue if rural women are head loading and we don't know the effects on their health. We go to climate change, and this is a real issue. I thank God that I'm here with you because I almost missed my transport to the airport because of the climate effect issue that happened in Washington and Virginia and Maryland. And the rising greenhouse gas emissions threatening to increase global warming by 2%. With the extreme weather conditions we are all experiencing, changing sea level, earthquakes, rainfall patterns changing, heavy droughts, floods, scarce materials, and all that. The climate change adds cost and complexity in development. This is why it's an issue really to be discussed in this conference. Paved services deterioration, structural design changing, expansion of bridge joints, for example, massive erosions and all that. Adaptation and mitigation will call for changes in engineering designs, operations including maintenance, and also use of resilience materials. And climate change hits poor people disproportionately, particularly women. And we need collective action and public policy and environmental coverage in our policies. It's not only the issue of the Department of Environment, it's actually the issue for everybody. And climate change challenges. Are the tools for environmental impact assessment appropriate for application in rural transport schemes? We are not sure. There's a problem of data availability because we depend on data from meteorological departments, for example, to inform the transport sector. Are we linking with them enough to be able to take measures in good time? And we need infrastructure essential design criteria, and which is why also we are sitting here. And we know that resilient designs are costly. For example, submersible roads in Bangladesh, they cost 58,000 to 66,000 per kilometer. And there is a problem, there could be a problem of buy-in, because who's going to pay the extra cost on taking into account the climate change issues? There's an issue of advocacy. Do we have examples of cost implications where if we don't take climate effect changes into the planning and design of rural transport infrastructure? Do we have capacity for climate vulnerability assessment, adaptation and mitigation measures? And also we have the issue of maintenance, because if we maintain our projects, our investment better, we could also address partly the issue of climate change. But we are short of maintenance, and yet we are facing the problem of climate change. So we have sort of a double problem here. And I just want to quote the alert that I found in my email yesterday. Resilience against the impact of global threats will depend on how prepared you are and how fast you can respond. The rural access and mobility, perspectives in the global development frameworks. And we ask ourselves a question: who is committed to filling the first mile gap? Some people call it the last mile gap, but we call it the first mile gap because the first mile gap is the one which takes you out of your household to go to somewhere else. And we are told that the growth and social policies have resulted in a decrease in share of people living in poverty in developing countries from 42% in 1990 going to 5% in 2015. That is the end of the Millennium Development Goal time horizon. And marked economic growth in Africa, with 20% of sub-Saharan African countries recording about 5% of annual economic growth since 2005, which is good. But how much of this is translating to rural areas? We have Paris Declaration 2005 coming with policy reforms by country and government multi-donor dialogue platforms, country-driven policy reforms, and move toward budget and sector support and also sector-wide approaches. What is the role of rural transport? The role of these policies in rural transport. Are we benefiting, is rural transport benefiting better from direct budget support and sector budget support? How about in SWAP? How is rural transport interacting with agriculture? Do we know enough of that? So we have to ask ourselves these questions. We have NEPAD Comprehensive Agricultural Development Program, Pillar 2, which is focused on infrastructure, and a good part of it is really to address the transport issues. But transport that is linking to corridors, and it's not necessarily the transport network, the rural transport network within the community. We continue with the global perspective. We have the UN Decade of Action for Road Safety, 2011 to 2020, aiming at reducing global road deaths in 2020. And this one is mainly focused on primary roads and urban networks. And these are seen to be the areas of accident concentration, because that is where the data is available. And we ask ourselves a question: who's driving the road safety agenda for rural transport to tap on the value of this added global perspective? And what are the safety and security standards for rural transport infrastructure design, vehicles, the IMT standards, the human factors, institutional issues, etc., and data availability? That is a problem. We have to ask ourselves all these questions. And recently we had the Rio 20 Conference on Sustainable Development, and we see that multilateral development banks have committed more than 175 billion to support sustainable transportation system over the next decade. But this is actually to improve green transportation and with a more focus in urban areas. I didn't see anything rural in the documents that I went through. And generally there is increased emphasis on regional integration and corridor development in Africa. And then going forward, I think we need some comprehensive rural transport studies, because the rural transport studies that we have in 1980s. I mean, that's 20 years old, more than 20 years. And we haven't had much study, in-depth study in rural transport area. We are addressing problems here and there, which is good because we are moving forward to addressing problems. But I think we need studies to understand the problems better, I mean, where we are now. And also to address the paucity of data and benchmarks. Do we have benchmarks? I mean, by 2015, Millennium Development Goal, are we able to inform our partners and stakeholders where we are as far as development in rural transport is concerned? And also we need to evaluate the impact of rural transport policies and strategies where they have been in place. We need to, this one will facilitate more informed policy decisions and to provide strategic direction for action. Also to support capacity building and advocacy. Without good data, it is difficult to advocate for increased rural transport infrastructure investment, for example. And also, such studies would inform further research and innovation. Going forward, partnership and networking is so essential. We know here that nobody can do it all alone. So this contributes to more solid regional and national justifications for increased advocacy on investment in rural transport infrastructure. We have the issue of knowledge and innovation. We need more studies in this area to understand the role of ICTs in facilitating rural transport. In some of our rural areas, we know that these days you can call a taxi, a motorcycle to come and pick you from your village if you have a working cell phone. But are these safe? We also have to ask if this is really safe. And there's also the issue of e-learning. More and more organizations are going towards e-learning. And are we able to capture the opportunity of e-learning for our people to increase capacity? We have a lot of gray material existing in many places, but we don't know exactly where they are. How do we get these ones in dissemination so that they benefit the knowledge? And we have to think of centers of excellence to increase capacity. Actually, we need a critical mass of capacity in rural transport, which we don't have in Africa. And to finalize, rural transport in Africa has been a staggering agenda. And we have a long way to go. But I think together, in partnership, we will be there. And this is why we are here in this meeting, in this conference. Thank you.